The hallway inside the academy was more like a museum than a school. The floors were made of marble that shone so brightly you could see your reflection in them, and the walls were lined with expensive paintings of old composers who looked down at everyone with serious faces. The air smelled of floor wax and expensive perfume, a smell that felt cold and unfamiliar to her. It was a place built for people who had money, people who had been taking music lessons since they were toddlers. It was not a place where someone like her usually walked. She moved through the hallway quietly, trying not to make a sound with her shoes. They were old, worn-out sneakers that had seen better days, and they squeaked slightly against the perfect floor with every step she took. She tried to walk on the balls of her feet to silence the noise, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. The jacket was her favorite one, a thick, warm thing that had belonged to her older brother, but it looked out of place among the cashmere sweaters and tailored coats that the other students wore. She kept her head down, watching her feet move, focusing on getting to the practice room without being noticed. But people noticed. They always did. As she passed a group of students standing near a tall window, the giggling stopped. It was that sudden, sharp silence that falls over a crowd when someone they consider different walks by. She didn't look up, but she could feel their eyes on her. She could feel them looking at her frizzy hair that she couldn't quite tame, and at the instrument case strapped to her back. It wasn't the sleek, new case that everyone else carried. It was a battered, old thing covered in stickers and scratches, held together by duct tape in one corner. To her, it was precious because it held the violin her grandfather had given her. To them, it looked like junk. "Is that the new girl?" She heard one of them whisper loudly, not even trying to be quiet. "The scholarship student?" "I heard she comes from the other side of the tracks," another voice replied, followed by a snicker. "I wonder if she even knows how to read music. She probably plays by ear like a street performer." She kept walking, her face getting hot. She wanted to turn around and say something. She wanted to tell them that she had practiced 4 hours every single day for the last 10 years. She wanted to tell them that she knew music better than anyone, because music was the only thing that had ever made sense to her. But she didn't say a word. She just kept walking, clutching the strap of her case until her knuckles turned white. She had learned a long time ago that arguing with people who had everything was a waste of energy. She finally reached the heavy oak door of the practice room and slipped inside, closing the world out. The room was small and soundproof, instantly cutting off the noise of the whispers. She let out a long breath she didn't know she was holding and leaned against the door for a moment. This was her sanctuary. It was the only place in this huge, fancy building where she felt like she belonged. She walked over to the chair in the center of the room, placed her case on the floor, and opened it. Inside lay her violin. It wasn't a famous brand, and the varnish was chipping off in a few spots. But to her, it was the most beautiful object in the world. She lifted it gently, feeling the weight of the wood against her chin. It felt like coming home. She closed her eyes and tightened the bow, listening to the familiar creak of the horsehair. For a moment, she forgot about the marble floors, the fancy clothes, and the mean whispers. She just thought about the music. She started to play a scale, simple and slow. The notes rang out clear and pure, filling the small room. She didn't play like the other students. They played with perfect technique, but it often sounded robotic, like a computer program. She played with feeling. She poured her loneliness, her anger, and her hopes into every note. When she played, she wasn't the poor girl from the wrong neighborhood anymore. She was a queen. She was powerful. However, the reality of the outside world was waiting for her as soon as she stopped playing. Today was not just another practice day. Today was the day of the placement evaluations. In just a few hours, she would have to walk onto the big stage and play in front of the entire faculty. The thought made her stomach twist into a knot. The faculty at this school were known for being brutal. They didn't just look for talent, they looked for polish. They looked for students who fit their mold. And she was terrified that she would be crushed under their expectations. She had heard stories about the main teacher, a man known for his sharp tongue and his cold stare. He had reduced students to tears in the past just by looking at them. He hated anything that wasn't traditional, and her style of playing was definitely not traditional. It was wild and raw. She knew that as soon as she stepped onto that stage, he would be looking for a reason to fail her. He would see her worn-out shoes and her old violin and make up his mind before she even drew the bow. She put the violin back in its case and sat in the chair for a long time, just staring at the wall. She thought about her mother, waking up at 4 in the morning to clean offices so she could afford these lessons. She thought about her grandfather, who had worked 2 jobs just to buy her that violin. She couldn't let them down. She couldn't go home and tell them that the mean kids were right, that she didn't belong there. She had to be strong, but the fear was heavy. It sat on her chest like a physical weight. The other students had years of confidence and expensive training backing them up. They had connections. They had parents who donated money to the school. She had nothing but her talent and her grit. She wondered if it would be enough. She wondered if, for the first time in her life, her hard work wouldn't pay off. A loud chime echoed through the building, signaling that the evaluation sessions were about to begin. The sound vibrated through the floor, shaking her out of her thoughts. It was time. She stood up, her legs feeling a little shaky. She strapped the heavy case onto her back again, taking one last look at the safe, quiet practice room. Then she opened the door and stepped back into the hallway. The hallway was now crowded with students, making their way to the auditorium. The noise level was high, a mix of nervous laughter and frantic last-minute warm-ups. As she merged into the crowd, she felt the familiar sensation of being an outsider. The crowd seemed to part around her like a river flowing around a rock. No one spoke to her. No one made eye contact. She was invisible, and yet, strangely, the target of every judgmental glance in the room. She kept her head high this time. She didn't look at her shoes. She walked with purpose, forcing herself to look confident even though her hands were sweating inside her pockets. She knew they were watching her, waiting for her to mess up, waiting for her to fail. They wanted to see the scholarship student crumble so they could go back to their comfortable lives and feel superior, but she had a fire inside her that they couldn't see. It was a quiet, burning fire that had started in a small, drafty apartment and had grown with every hour of practice. She was going to play. She was going to show them. She didn't know if she would win or if they would even like her music, but she knew one thing for sure. She was not going to let them scare her into silence. She took a deep breath, pushed open the heavy doors of the auditorium, and stepped into the blinding light of the stage. The auditorium was unlike anything she had ever seen before. It was massive, with ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into the shadows above. The seats were covered in dark red velvet, arranged in steep semicircles that looked down on the stage like the eyes of a giant beast. The air in here was different from the hallway. It was cooler, heavier, and smelled of old wood and dust. It was a room built for legends, for maestros, for people whose names were written in history books. It felt impossible that she was standing there, about to walk onto that wooden floor behind the heavy velvet curtains. The atmosphere was chaotic. Students were running through scales, their instruments creating a jumbled noise that sounded like 1,000 birds arguing. Some were pacing back and forth, muttering to themselves. Others were standing perfectly still, their faces pale with fear. She stood near the back, holding her violin case like a shield. She tried to blend into the shadows, but her heart was beating so hard she thought the person standing next to her might be able to hear it. One by one, names were called out. A student would walk through the curtain, and a few minutes later, they would walk back out. Some came out crying, silently wiping tears away with the backs of their hands. Others came out looking defeated, their shoulders slumped, staring at the floor as if they wanted the ground to swallow them whole. It was clear that the people on the other side of that curtain were not kind. Then, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. The noise in the waiting area instantly died down. 3 people walked in, ignoring the students completely. They moved with the kind of confidence that only comes from having power your entire life. In the middle was the head judge, a man with silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved out of stone. He wore a tuxedo that looked more expensive than her family's car. On his left was a woman with sharp glasses and a tighter mouth carrying a clipboard. On his right was a younger man, but he had the same arrogant tilt to his chin. This was the jury. They were the gatekeepers, and they did not look like they were in a generous mood as they passed by her. The silver-haired man paused. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her scuffed sneakers and her old jacket. He didn't say anything. He just let out a short, sharp breath through his nose, a sound of disgust, and kept walking. That tiny sound felt worse than a shout. It told her exactly what he thought of her before she had even played a single note. It confirmed her worst fear. To him, she was just dirt on the floor of his precious academy. The judges took their seats at a long table on the stage. The lights dimmed in the audience, and a spotlight hit the center of the stage. It was blindingly white. From the darkness of the wings, she watched the first student perform. It was a boy playing a cello. He played perfectly. Every note was in the right place. His technique was flawless. But when he finished, the judges just looked bored. The woman with the clipboard didn't even look up from her paper. The silver-haired man waved his hand, signaling for the next person. It wasn't about talent. It was about something else. It was about polish. It was about style. Things she couldn't buy in a store, finally. Her name was called Dot. It felt like someone had poured a bucket of ice water over her head. Her legs felt heavy as she walked toward the curtain. The stage manager gave her a nod, a look of pity in his eyes, and pushed her through the curtain. The walk to the center of the stage felt like the longest journey of her life. The floor squeaked under her shoes. In the silence of the huge room, the squeak sounded like a gunshot. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, but the only eyes that mattered were the three at the long table. She stepped into the spotlight. It was so bright she couldn't see the audience anymore, just the black void beyond the edge of the stage. She walked to the music stand, trying to keep her hands from shaking. She placed her violin case on the floor and opened it. As she lifted her instrument, she saw the woman with the clipboard lean over and whisper something to the silver-haired man. He chuckled softly. It was a dry, humorless sound that echoed in the quiet room. She positioned the violin under her chin. She took a deep breath, trying to remember the feeling in the practice room, trying to find that safe place inside her mind. She lifted her bow. She was about to start the first note, the most difficult part of the piece she had prepared, designed to show off technical skill. "Stop!" a voice boomed. It was the silver-haired man. He didn't yell, but his voice was loud and commanding. It cut through the air like a knife. Her hand froze in midair. The bow was just inches from the strings. She looked up, terrified. The man leaned back in his chair, a lazy smirk on his face. He didn't look at her face. He was looking at her violin. "We haven't got all day," he said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "Are you planning to tune that thing, or should we just guess the notes?" A ripple of laughter went through the dark room. It wasn't a nice laugh. It was the laugh of people who are relieved they aren't the one being humiliated. Her face burned with shame. She started to adjust the pegs, her fingers fumbling in her haste. "And look at that," the woman with the clipboard spoke up. Her voice was high and nasal. "That bow hair is fraying. It's been months since it was rehaired. How do you expect to produce any tone with that?" The younger judge shook his head, looking at his watch. "This is a conservatory, not a garage sale," he muttered loudly enough for the front row to hear. They weren't even listening to the music yet. They were judging her equipment. They were judging her clothes. They were judging her poverty. The silver-haired man waved his hand in the air as if he was swatting away a fly. "Look, let's be honest. We know why you are here. The scholarship." He said the word like it was a disease. "But we have a standard to maintain. This is embarrassing." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. She stood there on the giant stage, bathed in the harsh white light, holding her battered violin. The urge to run was overwhelming. She wanted to turn around, sprint off the stage, and never come back. She wanted to hide in her room and never play again. They had already decided she wasn't good enough. They had decided she was a joke, but then a strange thing happened. As she looked down at her violin, she saw the scratches on the wood. She remembered where each scratch came from. One from when she dropped it running for the bus in the rain. One from when her little brother knocked it over. This violin had lived a life, just like her. It wasn't polished and perfect like theirs. It was real. The anger started to rise in her chest, pushing out the fear. It was a slow, burning fire. Who were they to tell her she was embarrassing? They sat there in their expensive clothes, judging people they didn't know, judging art they couldn't feel. They wanted her to play their game, by their rules. They wanted her to be scared. She looked up, right at the silver-haired man. She didn't look down at her feet. She didn't look away. She narrowed her eyes slightly. She wasn't going to play their piece. She wasn't going to try to impress them with technical tricks. She was going to play something else. Something that would shut them up without asking for permission, without saying a word. She tightened her grip on the bow. She ignored the sheet music sitting on the stand. She closed her eyes for a split second, blocking out the lights, blocking out their faces, and found the music inside her heart. It was wild, it was angry, and it was beautiful. The judges were still smirking, waiting for her to scramble to fix her instrument or apologize. They were leaning back, ready to dismiss her. But she didn't move to fix the strings. She just lifted the bow, poised it over the strings, and prepared to unleash the storm that had been building up inside her for her entire life. The silence stretched for one more second, tense and electric. And then she began. The air in the auditorium was so thick you could almost touch it. The judges were still leaning back in their chairs, wearing looks of bored expectation. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for a screech of wrong notes, a shaky bow hand, or a burst of tears that would send her running off the stage. To them, she was just a formality, a student they had to pass through before they could get to the real. Musicians with the expensive instruments, but she didn't reach for the sheet music sitting on the stand. That music was a safe, boring piece that everyone else had played 100 times before. It was a test, yes, but it wasn't her. Instead, she closed her eyes for a split second and let the silence wash over her. In that darkness behind her eyelids, she saw her old living room. She saw the rain hitting the window, and she felt the hunger of wanting something more. She opened her eyes and looked straight ahead, not at the judges, but at the back wall of the hall. She lifted the bow. The silver-haired man let out a loud, annoyed sigh, checking his watch again, ready to wave his hand and cut her off. But before he could move, she struck the first note. It wasn't a gentle note. It was a jagged, tearing sound that seemed to rip through the quiet of the room. It was deep and rough, like a growl from the earth. It wasn't the polished, smooth sound they were used to hearing in this pristine hall. It was raw. It was ugly, but it was beautiful. The man's hand froze in midair. The sigh caught in his throat. He didn't wave her off. He blinked, his eyes snapping back to her. She didn't stop. From that first low growl, the music exploded. It wasn't a slow build-up. It was a sudden storm. Her left hand moved up the neck of the violin with a speed that made it look like a blur. Her right hand drove the bow across the strings so hard it looked like she was trying to cut them in half. The sound that came out was frantic, angry, and full of life. The woman with the sharp glasses stopped writing. Her pen hovered over the paper, ink dripping onto the clipboard, but she didn't notice. She was staring at the girl's fingers. They were flying over the fingerboard, hitting notes that shouldn't have been possible to play together. The music was chaotic, jumping from low, rumbling notes to high, screaming cries within seconds. It sounded like a fight, like a struggle for survival. The style was completely foreign to the judges. It wasn't the standard classical music they taught in textbooks. It had the structure of a symphony, but the soul of the streets. It had a rhythm that made you want to tap your foot, a driving beat that came from the percussion of her foot stomping on the floor. She was playing with a kind of violence that was terrifying to watch. Sweat began to bead on her forehead. Her breathing became heavy, visible in the cool air of the stage. She wasn't just playing the violin. She was wrestling with it. and the violin was screaming back in the most wonderful way. The younger judge, who had been looking at his phone, slowly put it down on the table. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his mouth slightly open. He had never heard a violin sound like this. Usually, students were so worried about playing perfectly that they forgot to play with emotion. They played like robots. But this girl? She was pouring her entire life into this song. Every bad day, every insult, every meal skipped so she could afford rent, it was all in there. The music shifted suddenly. The angry, fast pace slowed down into a haunting melody that floated over the audience like a ghost. It was sad, deeply sad. The notes hung in the air, vibrating against the high ceiling. The sound was so pure that it gave everyone goosebumps. The contrast between the violence of the first part and the sorrow of this part was shocking. In the back of the hall, the students who had been giggling earlier were now dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. They weren't whispering about her shoes anymore. They weren't looking at her jacket. They were watching her hands. They were realizing, maybe for the first time, that talent doesn't care about money. They were witnessing something rare. A moment of magic that doesn't happen very often in a lifetime. On stage, she was lost in the music. She didn't see the judges anymore. She didn't see the audience. All she saw was the color of the notes in her mind. She remembered the night her grandfather told her that music was the only thing that could travel through walls, the only thing that could reach people who didn't want to be reached. She was proving him right. She was reaching the parts of these rich, stuck-up people that they thought were dead. The tempo began to speed up again, but this time it wasn't angry. It was triumphant. The notes climbed higher and higher, spiraling up like a bird taking flight. The bow was moving so fast that smoke seemed to rise from the strings. The sound became brighter, sharper, cutting through the heavy air of the auditorium like a knife through hot butter. The silver-haired man sat up straighter. His face, which had been a mask of annoyance, was now blank. He was listening, not with his critical ear, looking for mistakes, but with his soul. He was a musician, after all, and he knew greatness when he heard it, even if it came from a battered instrument held by a girl in sneakers. He saw the calluses on her fingers, the tension in her jaw, and the sheer force of will she was using to command the room. He realized that this wasn't just a performance. This was a declaration of war. She was telling them that she belonged here, not because of their permission, but because of her gift. The music reached a fever pitch. It was a flurry of notes, so fast that they blended together into a single, soaring line of sound. It was the sound of a heart beating too fast, the sound of running for your life, the sound of breaking free. She was playing with an intensity that was almost scary. Her hair was falling out of its tie, sticking to her sweaty face. She didn't brush it away. She didn't care. She was pushing the violin to its absolute limit, making the old wood groan and sing in ways it probably hadn't in years. Then, just as the music seemed like it was going to spiral out of control, she did something unexpected. She stopped playing suddenly, right at the very peak of the sound. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the echo of the music vibrating in everyone's ears. The sudden stop was more powerful than any final chord could have been. She stood there, chest heaving, her bow still raised in the air. The spotlight shone down on her, illuminating the sweat on her face and the fire in her eyes. The last note hung in the air like a ghost before fading away completely. The room was paralyzed. No one moved. No one clapped. The students in the back were leaning forward, mouths open. The judges sat like statues, their eyes glued to the stage. The silver-haired man had completely forgotten about his watch. The woman with the glasses had let her clipboard slip off her lap and onto the floor with a loud thud, but she didn't even flinch. They were frozen. Not because they were bored, and not because they were confused. They were frozen because they had just been hit by a truckload of raw talent they hadn't seen coming. In a matter of minutes, the girl they had mocked had torn down their walls of prejudice and built a castle right there on the stage. She had taken their breath away and refused to give it back. The silence was deafening, a heavy, awe-filled silence that shouted louder than any applause ever could. The silence that filled the auditorium was not empty. It was heavy, thick, and vibrating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving a vacuum that pulled at everyone's chest. The last echo of the violin note had faded into the high rafters, but the ghost of the sound still seemed to hang in the dust motes dancing in the spotlight. For a long, stretching moment, time seemed to stop completely. On the stage, the girl stood perfectly still. Her chest was heaving up and down, her shirt sticking to her skin with sweat. Her right arm ached from the force of the playing, and her fingers felt numb against the neck of the violin. She slowly lowered the bow, letting the tip point toward the floor. As the adrenaline began to fade, a wave of cold fear washed over her. Why was it so quiet? Had she shocked them so much that they hated it? Had she crossed a line she couldn't uncross? In the harsh light, she suddenly felt very small again, wondering if she had just ruined her only chance by being too wild, too angry, too real. She risked a glance at the judge's table. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. The silver-haired man, the one who had been so ready to dismiss her, was sitting forward in his chair. Earlier, he had been leaning back, looking at his watch, completely bored. Now his posture was rigid like a statue carved from tension. His hand was frozen in the air, halfway to his face, as if he had been about to stroke his beard but had forgotten how to move. His eyes were wide, staring at her not with judgment but with a look of utter disbelief. The arrogance had been wiped clean off his face. For the first time in decades, perhaps, he didn't know what to say. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Or maybe a man who was seeing the sun for the first time after a lifetime of darkness. Beside him, the woman with the sharp glasses and the tight mouth was equally motionless. Her clipboard, which she had guarded so fiercely, had slipped off her lap and landed on the floor with a dull thud. She didn't even look down. She didn't care. Her pen was rolling away across the stage, but she didn't move to stop it. Her glasses had slid slightly down her nose, and her mouth was hanging open just a fraction of an inch. She was staring at the girl's battered violin as if it were a holy relic. She was realizing that all the technique, all the theory, and all the expensive lessons in the world couldn't produce the sound she had just heard. She was looking at raw genius, and it terrified her. The younger judge was the most frozen of all. He had been checking his phone, barely paying attention. Now his phone was screen down on the table, completely forgotten. He was leaning so far forward over the edge of the table that he looked like he might fall off. His mouth was open, his eyes blinking rapidly as if he was trying to wake up from a dream. He looked from the girl to the old man, then back to the girl, searching for an explanation. He looked like a student who had just been taught a lesson by the master. The hierarchy of the room had flipped in an instant. The people with the power were powerless, struck dumb by a girl with a broken violin and a dream. The silence stretched on, ticking by like seconds on a bomb. It was so quiet that you could hear the heating system clicking in the walls. You could hear the girl's shaky breathing amplified by the microphone. It was the kind of silence that happens when something truly profound occurs, when words are not enough to fill the space. It was a silence of respect, of shock, and of sudden understanding. In the back of the hall, the students were frozen too. The group of rich kids who had been whispering and giggling earlier were now statues. They weren't looking at their phones. They weren't whispering. They were staring at the stage, their faces pale in the dim light. The social lines that usually divided them, the rich kids versus the scholarship kids, the popular versus the outcasts, had all dissolved. Music had done what politics and money couldn't do. It had leveled the playing field. They realized they had just witnessed history. They realized that the girl they mocked was better than all of them put together. The air was thick with their regret and their awe. The girl shifted her weight slightly, the squeak of her shoe loud against the floorboards. The sound seemed to break the spell, just a little. The silver-haired man blinked, slowly, as if waking up from a deep trance. He looked at his hand, which was still frozen in mid-air, and slowly lowered it. He cleared his throat, but no sound came out. He tried to speak, to say something critical or dismissive, but the words wouldn't form. How could he criticize perfection? How could he mock honesty? He looked at the girl, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw the sweat, the determination, and the fire in her eyes. He realized that she hadn't played the music to please him. She hadn't played to pass a test. She had played to survive. And she had played better than he had heard in 40 years of teaching. A strange look passed over his face. It was a mixture of humility and shame. He adjusted his tie, his fingers trembling slightly. The other judges watched him, waiting for a cue, waiting for the leader to tell them what to think. But for once he had no answers. He was just a listener in the audience. Stripped of his authority by the sheer power of art, the girl stood there, waiting for a verdict. Her arm was getting tired holding the violin, but she refused to put it down. She wasn't going to cower. She wasn't going to apologize for being good. She looked right back at them, her gaze steady. The fear was gone now, replaced by a calm certainty. She knew what she had done. She knew she had poured her soul into those strings, and she knew they had felt it. They could reject her, they could fail her, they could kick her out of the school, but they couldn't take away the fact that, for 3 minutes, she had owned them. The woman with the glasses finally reached down and picked up her clipboard, but she didn't hold it like a shield anymore. She held it loosely, as if it didn't matter. She looked at the girl with a softness that hadn't been there before. The harsh lines of her face seemed to relax. She wasn't a judge anymore. She was a Fandot. The younger judge let out a long, shaky breath, the sound loud in the quiet room. He ran a hand through his hair, looking completely bewildered. He looked at the old man, his eyes asking a silent question. Asterisk, did you hear that? Did that really happen? Asterisk, the silence was no longer heavy. It was electric. It was the moment right before a dam breaks. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it felt like a violin string about to snap. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the reaction, waiting for the world to start moving again. The girl stood alone in the light, the center of the universe, holding the power of the room in her hands. She had frozen them with her talent, and now she held the power to unfreeze them. The seconds dragged on, feeling like hours as the reality of the performance settled over the room like a heavy blanket. The mockery was dead, killed by a melody. The prejudice was silenced, drowned out by a song. All that was left was the music echoing in their minds and the girl standing tall in the spotlight. The silence in the auditorium was so heavy that it felt like the world had stopped turning. The girl stood on the stage, her chest rising and falling, her grip on the violin bow tight enough to turn her knuckles white. She was waiting for the verdict. For a second, she was terrified that the silence meant they hated it, that they were just gathering their thoughts to tear her apart. She prepared herself for the cold words, for the laughter to start up again, for the humiliation of being told to leave, but then a movement broke the stillness. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a sight. The silver-haired man, the one with the stone face and the cruel eyes, slowly pushed his chair back. The legs of the chair scraped against the wooden floor, making a screeching noise that made everyone jump. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't look at the other judges. He kept his eyes locked on the girl, standing there in her worn-out sneakers and her old jacket. He placed his hands on the table in front of him and pushed himself up. He stood up. It was a shock to the system. In this school, the head judge never stood up for students. He barely nodded. But here he was, getting slowly to his feet. His face wasn't angry anymore. The arrogance had melted away, replaced by a look of solemn respect. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a miracle, or perhaps a man who realized he had been wrong about everything for a very long time. The woman with the sharp glasses looked at him, startled. She saw him standing, and after a moment's hesitation, she stood up too. She reached out and straightened her jacket, but her eyes never left the girl. The younger judge, looking confused and overwhelmed, scrambled to his feet as well, almost knocking his chair over in his haste. And then the sound came. It started as a slow clap from the silver-haired man. It wasn't polite clapping. It was heavy, rhythmic, and loud. Clap, clap, clap. The sound echoed through the hall, bouncing off the high ceilings. It was the sound of approval from the hardest man to please in the country. Suddenly, the dam broke. The students in the back, who had been holding their breath, exploded. It wasn't just clapping. It was a roar. It started as a wave of noise from the cheap seats and rushed forward like a tidal wave until it filled the entire room. People were on their feet. The bullies who had whispered in the hallway were now screaming and stomping their feet. The girl who had sat next to her in music class was crying, and clapping her hands raw. The girl stood frozen in the center of the storm. The spotlight was still blinding her, but she could feel the energy of the room. It was hitting her in waves, hot and loud. She saw the silver-haired man raising his hands above his head, clapping harder than anyone. He was smiling, not a fake smirk, but a real, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He was looking at her as if she were the daughter he never had, or the prodigy he had always searched for. Tears pricked her eyes, blurring her vision. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting to cry. She wasn't sad. She was overwhelmed. For years, she had felt invisible. She had felt like a ghost floating through a world that didn't want her. She had been told that her clothes weren't good enough, that her violin wasn't good enough, and that she wasn't good enough. But in this moment, looking out at the sea of standing people, she knew the truth. She was more than enough. She was better than enough. The applause went on and on. It lasted for minutes. No one wanted to sit down. No one wanted it to end. The air in the room had completely changed. The coldness, the elitism, the judgment, it had all been burned away by the fire of her music. The barriers between the rich kids and the scholarship kids, the judges and the students, the powerful and the weak, they had all dissolved. There was only the music and the universal language of awe that it spoke. Finally, the silver-haired man stepped forward to the edge of the stage. The crowd began to quiet down, sensing he wanted to speak. He raised his hand for silence, and the room obeyed instantly. The girl's heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself for his words. He didn't use a microphone, but his voice carried clearly in the quiet hall. "I have been teaching at this academy for 40 years, he said, his voice rough but soft. "I have heard thousands of violinists. Some were perfect. Some were technical geniuses. But in all that time, I have never heard anyone play with their soul." He paused, looking around the room at the other students. "We teach you technique. We teach you theory. We teach you how to play the notes correctly. But we cannot teach you what she just did. What she just did is a gift. It is raw, it is real, and it is rare." He turned back to her, and his eyes were shining. "You do not need a scholarship to justify your place here. You have earned your place on that stage. You have earned our respect." A new wave of cheers erupted from the students. The girl felt a lump in her throat the size of a rock. She bowed. It wasn't a small, scared bow this time. It was a deep, graceful bow from the waist, holding the pose as the applause washed over her. When she stood up, she was smiling. It was a smile that reached her eyes, a smile of pure victory. She slowly packed her violin into its battered case. The case that she had been ashamed of earlier now looked like a treasure chest. She snapped the latches shut and swung it onto her back. As she walked off the stage, the students in the front row reached out to touch her shoulder, to high-five her, to just be close to the magic that had happened. She walked through the curtain, her legs feeling wobbly but light. Backstage it was quiet, but the air was buzzing. The other students waiting to play looked at her with wide eyes. They didn't look down on her anymore. They looked at her with reverence. They knew the bar had just been raised, and they knew they couldn't reach it. As she walked down the long hallway toward the exit, she heard the footsteps behind her. She turned to see the silver-haired man following her. He wasn't surrounded by his entourage. He was alone. He walked up to her, stopping a few feet away. "I was wrong about you," he said simply. There was no excuse, no long apology, just the truth. "I let your appearance blind me to your talent. That is my failure, not yours. I hope you will forgive an old fool for his arrogance." The girl looked at him. She saw the man who had tried to humiliate her, but she also saw the man who had given her a standing ovation. She realized that holding on to anger would only weigh her down. "I forgive you," she said softly, "but don't do it to the next kid." The old man smiled, a chuckle escaping his lips. "I won't. I promise you I won't." He watched her walk away, heading toward the glass doors that led out to the street. She pushed the doors open and stepped out into the cool evening air. The city was bustling with noise cars honking, people talking, sirens wailing, but it sounded beautiful to her. It sounded like music. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh air. She didn't have a fancy violin. She didn't have expensive clothes. But she had something that no one could ever take away from her. She had her voice, and she had finally made the world listen. She adjusted the strap of her case on her shoulder and walked down the street, her head held high, ready for whatever came next. She wasn't the outsider anymore. She was a musician, and the world was her stage.